You have an apartment. It's 45 square meters and is made of concrete. It's been here since the 1960s, though it wasn't designed to last so long. The insulation is bad, you can hear the neighbors, and it's pretty cramped. The stairwell is falling apart and hasn't been cleaned in years. But the building is only 5 stories tall, as are the rest in the district, and there's a lot of green space. You've had family living in this apartment for years. You are in any of thousands of places because you're in a standardized apartments building from the 1467 series that was built across giant swaths of the former Soviet Union.
Mass housing across the world, most of it built in the second half of the 20th century, is still home to millions of people. Treatment of these buildings varies greatly depending on context, and residents often have limited options about what they can do with their apartments. The two of us learned about these buildings when we got funding through MIT to spend a summer in Russia in 2019. We were hosted by a local architecture firm, which supported us as we explored Soviet housing. We visited housing districts in cities across Russia, the Baltics, and the Caucasus. And while living in Moscow, we spent time learning about these buildings and archives through interviews and thanks to tours from friends and colleagues. We had tea and cake at a family home at the top floor of one of the buildings, and were given a presentation by the consulting company that is organizing their widespread demolition. We became starkly aware of how different they are from what we know, but we were lucky enough to be able to see them through the culture and people that they have come to shape. Some residents cherish them, while others are eager to have them destroyed. In some places they've been wiped out, while elsewhere they are ubiquitous. While we were in Russia, and in the time since, we've relied on the expertise and generosity of many people who have directed and shaped how we think about the buildings. Through all of this, it has become clear to us that no matter what happens to Soviet mass housing, its legacy is deeply entrenched and will continue to shape the built environment for generations to come. We argue that it is essential to keep the original buildings with modifications and updates to create agency for residents in how this legacy is carried into the future. We'll talk about 3 scenarios in which residents of the same type of prefabricated modernist housing, in sites spread across the former Soviet territory, collectively leverage their apartments to create renovations that serve their common interests. Our work is a contribution to the decades-long history of Soviet housing renovation, which has shaped and differentiated what were once identical structures. With this in mind, we draw from both the history of the buildings as much as their current varied circumstances, suggesting contextualized ways that the massive system of Soviet housing can be carried forward.
But first, what exactly are these buildings? They have a nickname, Khrushchevki, derived from Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader who succeeded Stalin, and in 1958 declared that all Soviet families, many of them living in slums and communal homes at the time, will be given an apartment of their own. His program was widely ambitious, and its core tenet was to introduce the widespread industrialization of housing construction. Its effect remains unparalleled in its scale and impact. Between 1960 and 1975, 1.55 billion square meters of new housing were constructed, and 2 out of every 3 inhabitants of the USSR were rehoused. But how did they do it? The cutting-edge technology at the time was prefabricated panel housing, which used large concrete panels that were constructed in factories, then driven to site and assembled with cranes. This type of building was designed in parallel with the system that produced it, and both were ruthlessly optimized for efficiency and cost. Rather than designing buildings, architects designed building series, which were effectively product lines. These were each developed, tested, refined, and only then constructed at an enormous scale. The type of building we will focus on is called a 1467, which was built in the southern across the USSR. This series is unique for its use of half-story tall facade panels which can be removed without compromising the building structure. It consists of 4 apartment types, which are 45 square meters on average. But today, a significant portion of the people living in the structures are confronted with urgent problems related to the decay of their living spaces. There are no standard solutions, and for the most part, residents are either left to carry out their own renovations, which are inefficient and have a limited scope, or they depend on sweeping renovation programs, which give them few choices and fail to account for the value of their current apartments. We suggest a series of alternatives in which residents, builders, and developers work with local stakeholders to achieve localized solutions that improve the living spaces of residents. We strive to help people see what they already have and to catalyze the partnerships and collaborations that they'll need to carry out their own renovations.
You are in Surgut, Siberia. It was a minor town until the 1960s when oil was found in the region, and it swiftly expanded into a regional metropolis. Today, almost 400,000 people live here. Many buildings here are of the 1467 series. They're in bad shape. They were built, along with many other buildings in the city, by the same companies that were founded to construct infrastructure for oil extraction in the region. But even back then, the 1467 design was out of place here. The average annual temperature is below freezing, yet they still built apartments with balconies and bad insulation, which were clearly designed for warmer places than Surgut. You, like all of your neighbors, live in a modified apartment. Years ago, your dad hired a friend to build walls around the balcony so that he and your mom could use it for their plants. These days, there aren't any more plants, but you appreciate the extra space to store your shoes. People have always changed these apartments, and doing so became all the more common after the USSR came apart in the 1990s. Your grandparents moved in soon after the building was built in the 60s and lived here rent-free. When it went up for sale in the 1990s, as everything was privatized, they bought it for nothing. This didn't change much at the time, but it was important. Basically, overnight, they moved from a world in which the state owned and managed everything to one in which things were more fragmented. All of a sudden, they owned the apartment, along with a share of the stairwell and roof, and had some stake in the land. By the time you inherited the apartment, having a deed made a big difference. Whatever you invested made the unit more valuable on the market. You could sell it if you wanted to and go buy something else. It was an asset. Your grandparents had never seen it this way. At the same time, the shift in ownership left public space and common property in the hands of people who didn't have the means or interest to maintain it. Your grandparents never saw much of a difference between their apartment and what was around it. Workers from the city tended to all the greenery. But since the 1990s, everyone has just focused on their own apartments. Unsurprisingly, this means that the stairwell is falling apart, nobody takes responsibility for problems with the walls and roof, and all the greenery is overgrown. Imagine if you could use the fact of your ownership to navigate improvements to all of your common goods. Surgut has the 4th highest salaries and real estate prices in Russia, and there are ways to do more.
You are in Riga, Latvia, surrounded by 1467 residential buildings, albeit 2,700 kilometers to the west of Surgut. You grew up here in the Kangaraks neighborhood. The buildings and the district were all designed and built as part of the master plan, with schools, trees, and parks that date back to Soviet times. But even though the district came from the same designs used for countless others across the former USSR, the country took a very different path post-collapse than most of the other Soviet republics. Your parents, with you on their shoulders, joined hands alongside 2 million other people in 1989 in a protest across the Baltic states that eventually gave way to Latvian independence. When you were in school, Latvia joined the EU, and at some point after university, you traded in all your lats for euros. Since then, your parents have moved to the countryside, leaving you the apartment. It's in a good location, but it barely keeps out the cold and is too small for a family. There is EU money available to invest in new insulation for lived-in buildings. But when the idea of tapping into these funds has come up with your neighbors, nobody can agree whether it will be worthwhile. So your building, like all but a handful in the district, has remained as it is. Just imagine if you had more say over the renovation and could get more out of it than a layer of insulation. If the project could appeal to more people, then you'd be able to get more out of it together.
You, finally, are in Zelenograd, a satellite district of Moscow about 50 kilometers from the center. This whole area was planned and built in the 1960s, when the city wanted somewhere to house its growing population. They were also planning to build factories in the area, but this never happened, so you all commute to jobs downtown in overcrowded trains. The one factory they did build was to make concrete parts for buildings. This happened everywhere in the USSR, where hundreds of prefabricated concrete facilities were built to make building elements for thousands of apartments across the country. But, like so much else, these factories were privatized in the 1990s, and in many cases sold to companies that are now the most prominent housing developers in Russia. In Moscow, these developers have partnered with the city government to execute the largest urban renewal program in Europe. They demolish apartments like yours and replace them with tall buildings that they fabricate cheaply with outdated Soviet-era production facilities. They claim that they won't demolish a building unless 60% of residents agree to be relocated. But you've heard otherwise from more friends than you can count. Some powerful people want these buildings to come down, and they're making it happen. The big problem is that the towers that replace them are too tall. It's depressing to walk around them, and all the metros, schools, and infrastructure in their neighborhoods end up overloaded by all the new residents. You don't like what this is doing to the city, but what it shows you is that developers can make a lot of money off of buildings like yours. They claim that you'll get an upgraded apartment if you agree to move, but we believe there are better alternatives in which you stay put. We think you should see your apartment as a starting point rather than an asset that can be traded and replaced. By leveraging different parts of it, you can take a more active role in how the city gets shaped around you.
In Surgut, you want more space and a warmer apartment, but you can't afford it. Even the neighbors who do put money into their apartments don't get much out of it, since they can't fix the problems with the facade and roof. But the land you're sitting on is worth a lot, given its location and the number of people moving to the area. So our idea is that you join together with residents on one side of the building, sidestepping the staunchly opposed handful of people to the other side, who do not want to be bothered by a renovation. Together, you build new apartments next to your building, using some of the original structure and circulation. By selling these off, you can finance the new construction, as well as renovations to existing apartments and the construction of new common spaces. Since these benefits will come at no cost to residents, most of them opt in. Together, you form a housing cooperative, and you join the board that directs the project. The towers fit 22 new apartments that you build onto the stairwells of the existing structure. They're made with cross-laminated timber panels, which use Siberian lumber and are fabricated in a new facility that ships to site via the Ob River. You get a developer to price out the new design. They source bids from various contractors, which you cite when getting a loan from World Bank. The European Bank for Development and Reconstruction gives your cooperative a loan as part of a €6 million contract they've signed for housing improvement in the area. You petition the city of Surgut for a more flexible zoning ordinance to build taller on your plot, which they grant you under the logic that others might do the same and this slowly improve housing across the city. Your units get a new bedroom in the tower, which compensates for the extra disturbance you put up with by having the new construction under your nose. Your cooperative sells off the new units for slightly below market rates, and you vet the applicants for people who will fit in with the group. The whole cooperative has access to common spaces on the roof of the new tower. It has a big common room, along with a bar, some exercise equipment, and a sauna that's connected to a terrace, kept warm in winter with fire pits. The CLT construction process comes together quickly, and you end up with your new apartment before long. A neighbor on the bottom floor ends up buying one of the new units, enamored by the new space.
In Riga, despite the advantages to getting an EU-funded facade renovation, it doesn't seem worth the bother, let alone the money of your own you'd need to put into it. You, like most people in your building, aren't willing to put up with much if all you'd end up with is more insulation. But EU money is a unique resource, and we think you could be more strategic in how you make use of it by accommodating the varied interests of the 120 residents of your building. Instead of funding the entirety of a project, we think EU subsidies should go towards a baseline renovation for all apartments that include more space along with increased building performance. Residents would still need to contribute some of their own money via subsidized loans, but unlike insulation-based renovations, the additional space would increase their property value proportionally with their investment. Those with more available to spend could invest it in facade panels with larger windows and a balcony. The facade is not structural and is built with CLT panels sourced from a new facility on the outskirts of town. This means that down the line, you can easily swap out your facade panel for one with a different configuration of windows and balconies. Your building association starts the project by combining the 2 plots of land that your building spans and electing a new management team for the project. The city of Riga makes additional financing available to pay for setup costs at the CLT factory, encouraging the use of the more sustainable material, which it hopes others will use in subsequent renovations. They also pay the Latvian Association of Landscape Architects to organize design charrettes for a redesign of the garden space on your newly combined plot. The population of the city is shrinking, and there are 2 units in your building that have been on the market for months. Your building association gets a loan to buy them both, which it will pay off by renting out one of them on Airbnb. You convert the other into a common space, which you use for group meetings and events. When the first is not used for rentals, residents can book it by the night to put up their own visitors. You coordinate with an older couple you know 2 stories up to swap apartments during construction. They have more space than they need, which you could use with your 2 kids. In exchange, you pay them the difference in apartment values, which they spend on large windows and a balcony in their new unit.
In Moscow, you see new towers going up all around you, and can't believe how bad things have gotten in your own building. There are cracks in all the concrete, and the facade is falling apart. You wanted to invest in a new kitchen, but haven't been able to justify it, since nobody will buy your units off you, given the sorry state of the rest of the building. Over the years, you've gotten to know the people who live in the 14 other apartments of your stairwell quite well. We suggest that, as a group, you could form a cooperative and make significant changes to your building. Here's a design where you only renovate the building around your stairwell. Each apartment gets more floor space in a thickened facade, which supports 2 floors of additional units at the top of the building. The renovation is cost neutral for you and your fellow members, since you pay for everything by reselling the new units. You use CLT panels from a factory in the region that's already supplying parts to a new construction site downtown. To make it happen, you work with the city's planning office, which is quick to give you authorizations since it wants to promote some small-scale alternative in parallel with the mass reconstruction going on across the city. You sell the 4 new units on the roof to candidates via an application process, since you want them to fit in with the group. The new units are larger and fill a gap in the market, which is saturated with smaller apartments. In addition to your own renovations, all of you get access to the new rooftop and an elevator.
These proposals are all very specific to where you are and couldn't be identically replicated elsewhere. But we hope that by going through the process, you can inspire others to investigate how they might adapt your approach to a renovation to their circumstances. Many people live in buildings like yours, albeit with variations and peculiarities. We have not designed for the urban space you live in because there are already people working to improve and restore it. Your buildings, however, have too often been dismissed, despite their presence and significance. This is why they've been the focus of our work. We think that the Soviet housing that still stands is an indication of common conditions across wildly different contexts. No two buildings and no two residents are the same, and no solution will serve them all. But you can learn from the many people who live in circumstances similar to yours, and more importantly, accomplish more by working alongside them. Soviet housing was a godsend for many families when it was first built. Today, living standards have gone up while the quality of the housing has deteriorated. A handful of municipal governments have the financial resources and political foresight to demolish buildings like yours and replace them with new structures. But most places will need to work with what's still standing. This is an opportunity for you to rebuild and renovate rather than a call to start anew. The walls can move out, the roof can go up, residents can reconfigure. Life in the buildings can carry them forward.